The moment doesn't begin with shouting. It begins with stillness. Studio lights burn hot, applause fades too quickly, and something unspoken settles over the table. Meghan Markle smiles the way she's been trained to smile, polished and practiced, waiting for affirmation she expects will come. This is The View, after all. A place where stories are framed gently, where pain is nodded at, where guests are protected from sharp edges. She leans forward, confident, mid-thought, mid-narrative, believing the moment belongs to her. Across from her, Howard Stern doesn't interrupt. He studies. He listens longer than expected. The audience senses it before she does. There's a hesitation in the air, a subtle delay that feels wrong on live television. When Stern finally speaks, his voice is calm, almost conversational. No insult. No raised volume. Just a sentence that lands heavier than shouting ever could. The smile on Meghan's face falters. Not dramatically. Just enough. Her eyes flick sideways, searching for rescue, for the familiar rhythm of agreement. It doesn't come. Instead, the room grows quiet. Too quiet. The kind of silence that makes people uncomfortable because it asks them to think. For years, Meghan has controlled the frame. Interviews edited. Questions softened. Critics dismissed as cruel or irrelevant. She has been allowed to speak without being challenged, to tell her story without contradiction. But Stern doesn't argue. He simply holds the mirror up and refuses to look away. A ripple moves through the audience. Someone gasps. Someone claps, then stops, unsure if applause is allowed yet. Joy Behar freezes, caught between instinct and protocol. The producers don't cut away. They can't. Whatever is happening is bigger than the show now. Meghan shifts in her seat. Her voice tightens as she responds, repeating familiar lines, reaching for language that has always worked before. But this time, it doesn't land. The words feel lighter, thinner, as if the weight behind them has disappeared. Stern waits again. Then he follows up, gently, precisely. And in that instant, the illusion cracks. Meghan's confidence slips. Her hand reaches for the microphone, fingers trembling just enough to notice. She exhales, stands, and removes it. The chair scrapes softly against the floor. No music plays. No one speaks. As Meghan walks off the set, eyes glassy, America doesn't blink. Because everyone can feel it. This wasn't supposed to happen. And nothing after this will unfold the way she planned. What began as another safe appearance had transformed into a moment no publicist could rewind or contain anymore now. Rewind the clock to the promise of safety. The View was never just a talk show. It was a sanctuary where stories arrived pre-framed, pain was affirmed, and guests were cushioned from sharp questions. For years, celebrities learned the rules. Speak the language of vulnerability, lean into resilience, trust the hosts to nod along. The audience expected empathy, not interrogation. That expectation shaped the room long before the cameras rolled, and it shaped what Meghan Markle believed would happen next. Her media strategy had been meticulous. Appear selectively. Choose platforms known for warmth. Repeat the message until it felt familiar enough to be true. Every interview carried the same rhythm, the same carefully rehearsed beats, the same assurance that disagreement would be labeled cruelty. This appearance was supposed to be another controlled win, another chapter in a story already written. Meghan walked in confident that the frame belonged to her, and that nothing unscripted could pierce it. For many watching at home, especially immigrants and first-generation Americans, that framing had begun to feel hollow. They knew what it meant to navigate systems without protection, to be questioned harshly without applause waiting at the end. They had learned resilience without branding, survival without sympathetic panels. When they saw powerful figures shielded from scrutiny, it didn't feel compassionate. It felt unequal. A quiet resentment had been building, not toward vulnerability itself, but toward vulnerability that was never allowed to be challenged. This tension had been simmering beneath the surface of media culture for years. People sensed that empathy had become a performance, that certain stories were elevated while others were dismissed as inconvenient. The exhaustion wasn't cruel, it was human. Audiences wanted truth that could withstand pressure, narratives strong enough to face questions without collapsing. They wanted conversations that respected their intelligence, not just their emotions. But then there was Howard Stern. Booked for ratings, invited for edge, quietly expected to soften himself for daytime television. Stern had built a career saying what others avoided, but producers assumed the setting would tame him. They believed context would do the work, that the tone of the room would keep him within bounds. What they underestimated was his patience. Stern didn't need shock. He needed clarity. That contrast mattered. Because this episode wasn't about gossip or personality clashes. It landed in a cultural moment thick with frustration. Viewers were tired of celebrity victimhood presented without challenge. They were exhausted by media protection bubbles that insulated powerful figures from accountability. They sensed the gap between lived experience and manufactured authenticity, especially among immigrants and outsiders who had navigated real exclusion without a microphone or a platform. For them, this moment carried weight. It spoke to a deeper hunger for honesty, for conversations that didn't end the second discomfort appeared. It asked whether dignity came from telling a story repeatedly, or from allowing it to be tested. The stakes weren't just reputational, they were moral. Who gets questioned, and who gets protected, defines the culture watching. It was the kind of moment viewers recognize instantly. When comfort ends, accountability begins, and the story stops belonging to the people who rehearsed it publicly now. So when Stern leaned forward, calm and unflinching, it wasn't rebellion. It was collision. Two realities meeting without a buffer. The View's promise of safety met Stern's insistence on truth, and something had to give. The audience could feel it, that subtle shift when control slips and reality asserts itself. And no. One embodied the illusion of control more than Meghan Markle herself. Meghan Markle's story has always been presented as a modern parable. An outsider steps into the most rigid institution on earth and dares to challenge it from the inside. She is framed as self-made, independent, and brave, a woman who disrupted centuries of tradition with nothing but her voice and her values. For many viewers, especially those who understand what it means to feel out of place, that narrative landed powerfully. It promised representation, progress, and a rewriting of old hierarchies. Over time, that story evolved into something even larger. Meghan wasn't just an outsider turned royal. She became a symbol of resistance against institutions portrayed as cold, outdated, and hostile. Interviews painted her as a woman silenced, misunderstood, and targeted for daring to exist differently. She spoke openly about mental health, about isolation, about the cost of public scrutiny. The language was intimate, confessional, and morally charged. To question it felt, at times, like questioning compassion itself. But narratives that grow too polished invite closer attention. As appearances multiplied, patterns emerged. The vulnerability was always framed carefully, delivered through friendly platforms, surrounded by agreement. Pain was shared, but rarely interrogated. Claims were made, then repeated, often without challenge, until repetition itself began to sound like proof. What initially felt raw started to feel rehearsed. Viewers began to notice subtle shifts. Details that changed from interview to interview. Emphasis placed here, softened there. Stories retold with slightly different edges depending on the audience. It wasn't that contradictions were explosive. It was that they accumulated quietly. A date moved. A reaction intensified. A silence became an accusation. Individually, they seemed small. Together, they created unease. This is where skepticism crept in, not as cruelty, but as pattern recognition. Immigrant families watching knew how memory works under pressure, how trauma can blur timelines, but they also knew when storytelling becomes strategy. They recognized the difference between lived pain and curated suffering, between speaking truth and managing perception. The applause continued, but it sounded less certain. Meghan's interviews increasingly followed a familiar arc. The hurt was centered. The institution was blamed. The hosts nodded. The audience affirmed. There was rarely a moment of resistance, rarely a question that lingered long enough to challenge the frame. Over time, that protection became part of the story itself. She wasn't just telling her truth, she was telling it in spaces designed to defend it. There was also the question of scale. Meghan's story was always told from the highest platforms, amplified by global media, backed by wealth, lawyers, and publicists. For viewers who had navigated discrimination without safety nets, that contrast mattered. They didn't resent her success, they questioned the framing. When power speaks as if powerless, something feels off. When influence presents itself as oppression, audiences lean closer, not to attack, but to understand where the line is being blurred. Each new appearance added another layer to that tension. The tone sharpened, the grievances broadened, the certainty hardened. What once sounded like reflection began to sound like indictment. Institutions were reduced to villains, nuance stripped away in favor of moral clarity that left no room for complexity. For people who live inside systems they critique daily, that simplification rang hollow. Life, they knew, was messier than the version being offered on television. The story still stood, but it required agreement to breathe, applause to survive, and carefully chosen rooms where no one asked what happened when the camera stopped rolling or pressed harder. Because Meghan Markle was not someone used to silence after she spoke. She was used to applause, validation, and protection. She was used to telling her story without interruption, without follow-up questions that pressed too close. And the longer that pattern held, the more precarious it became. What made this moment different wasn't hostility. It was the absence of deference. Across the table sat someone uninterested in saving face or preserving narrative symmetry. Someone who didn't care about optics, only honesty. Howard Stern was never supposed to be the hero of this story. For decades, he was framed as the villain, the shock jock who thrived on provocation and controversy. That version of Stern is what producers thought they were booking. But time changes people, especially those who have lived under a microscope. Stern had already burned down his old persona long before this moment. He didn't need chaos anymore to be heard. Age had stripped him of insecurity and replaced it with something sharper. Years of therapy, reflection, and public mistakes had refined his instincts. He understood performance because he had built an empire on it. Fame had taught Stern what it does to people when applause becomes oxygen. It distorts memory, rewards exaggeration, and punishes honesty. Watching celebrities carefully sculpt their pain was not new to him. He had seen it on radio, on red carpets, in private conversations that never made headlines. He knew the difference between vulnerability that seeks understanding and vulnerability that demands obedience. This was the evolution viewers rarely acknowledged. They remembered the shock jock caricature, not the man who had grown quieter and more precise. That precision mattered now. Because sitting at that table, Stern wasn't interested in humiliating anyone. He wasn't angry, and he certainly wasn't cruel. He was composed in a way that unsettled people who expected fireworks. Calm, when paired with truth, has a way of dismantling defenses. Stern knew that silence could be more confrontational than insults. He knew that waiting was sometimes the most aggressive move. This patience came from experience, not restraint. From decades of being misinterpreted, misquoted, and underestimated. He had learned that letting people speak long enough often revealed more than interrupting them. So when Meghan spoke in polished sentences and familiar refrains, Stern listened. He didn't smirk or scoff. He observed the rhythm, the emphasis, the careful emotional cues. To Stern, it wasn't personal. It was structural. He recognized a performance designed to elicit agreement rather than examination. That recognition is what made him dangerous in this setting. Not because he wanted conflict, but because he refused to play along. He understood the mechanics of media protection and knew exactly where they failed. For immigrant families watching, this mattered more than they might admit. They had lived through moments where politeness masked power and narratives were enforced through silence. They knew how authority often hides behind courtesy. Stern wasn't there to rescue or to attack. He was there to clarify. And clarity, in a room built on affirmation, is disruptive. That's why his presence shifted the energy before he ever spoke. The audience could sense it, even if they couldn't articulate it yet. There was an imbalance now, a variable no one could control. Stern's power wasn't volume, it was restraint. He didn't need to dominate the conversation to guide it. All he had to do was wait for the right opening. And as Meghan continued, confident in the safety of the format, that opening approached. The hosts nodded, the applause followed, and the rhythm held. Stern remained still. He wasn't waiting to embarrass her. He was waiting for the moment the script revealed itself. Because once that happened, a single question would be enough. The danger wasn't what Stern would say. It was what he would allow the audience to see. And when the conversation drifted off script, Stern didn't interrupt. He waited. That waiting stretched seconds into something heavier, something noticeable. It invited the room to lean forward rather than relax back. In that pause, control began to loosen. People sense truth before it is spoken. They feel it in the hesitation, in the breath taken too carefully. Stern trusted that instinct, both his own and the audience's. This was not the old Stern chasing shock for relevance. This was a man secure enough to let the moment come to him. And that security made the coming question unavoidable. Because when honesty finally enters a room built on affirmation, it doesn't knock. It simply arrives, calm and undeniable. And everyone feels the shift before they understand it. So as Meghan finished her thought, expecting the familiar response, Stern leaned forward. No anger. No edge. Just patience sharpened into purpose. The audience sensed it immediately. The smiles were still there, but they had begun to strain. Something was about to be asked that could not be unasked. Stern had waited long enough. And with that calm that unsettles more than rage ever could, he finally spoke. What followed would expose the fragile architecture beneath the narrative. It would reveal how much depended on agreement and how little on truth. And it would test whether composure could survive a single, honest question. In that moment, the room held its breath. Not because of what had been said, but because of what was coming. The calm before impact had arrived. And no one at that table was prepared for how quickly the balance would shift. Because when patience finally gives way to precision, there is nowhere to hide. The question was already forming. The moment had arrived. So when the conversation drifted off script, Stern didn't interrupt. He waited. And in that waiting, the stage was set for a reckoning no one could soften or control. The next sentence would change everything. And it would be heard by millions who had been waiting just as long. The silence held on. The conversation began like any other, measured and polite. Meghan spoke in the polished soundbites that had carried her through countless interviews, each carefully selected phrase designed to elicit agreement. Her voice was steady, confident, practiced. She leaned forward, eyes bright, hands gesturing with the grace of someone who had rehearsed every inflection. Across the table, the hosts nodded, smiles fixed, laughter timed for effect. The audience clapped politely, filling the gaps as if to reinforce a story already written. The rhythm was familiar, predictable, comforting. But Howard Stern didn't follow the rhythm. He didn't match the cadence of approval. He didn't offer a single nod or a laugh. He simply listened. And in that act of listening, he created tension. Each carefully rehearsed line Meghan delivered landed with slightly less certainty. The smiles around her remained, but they began to feel fragile, stretched by the awareness that someone in the room wasn't playing along. Then Stern asked a question. Not sharp. Not hostile. Simple. Precise. Just enough to disturb the balance without breaking it. Can you explain how your public narrative aligns with what you've said before about the institutions you left? The room held its breath. The audience shifted in their seats, sensing the change, feeling the ripple of something about to disrupt their expectations. It wasn't an accusation. It was a quiet spotlight on contradiction. Meghan hesitated, a subtle flicker crossing her eyes. Her practiced responses stumbled, not dramatically, but noticeably. She deflected, choosing words carefully, measuring each phrase against the invisible bar of approval she assumed would always protect her. Stern leaned in slightly, eyes steady, allowing the silence to stretch long enough that the deflection sounded less convincing. Every pause magnified the cracks in her polished armor. The hosts tried to intervene subtly, guiding the conversation back to familiar territory. Their nods quickened, voices pitched higher, laughter inserted at the precise moment to cover tension. But it was too late. The audience felt the shift in real time. The controlled narrative had begun to unravel. The smiles around the table were still there, but they no longer reached her eyes. Something was breaking, and everyone could sense it. Stern followed up, not aggressively, not loudly, but with meticulous calm. He asked about inconsistencies in timelines, phrasing, and past statements, framing them as questions rather than attacks. The pressure mounted without a sound. Meghan's voice tightened further. Her usual cadence faltered. The audience, trained to trust the rhythm of the show, now sensed dissonance. They leaned forward in their seats, drawn by the subtle tension. That screamed louder than any shouting ever could. Every word from Stern seemed to carry invisible weight, testing not just her story but her composure. The hosts exchanged brief glances, tension visible behind the carefully maintained smiles. Something unspoken hovered over the set, the realization that this was no longer a controlled environment. Stern was no longer following the script, he was quietly reshaping it with precision. And then the first real crack appeared. Meghan paused mid-thought, searching for rescue, for affirmation that wouldn't come. Her polished lines, designed to glide seamlessly through rehearsed interviews, now sounded brittle. The audience sensed it instinctively, an unmistakable shift that made the stakes feel immediate, personal, consequential. This was more than discomfort. It was a subtle but unmistakable challenge. Stern didn't attack, he observed. He waited. Every carefully measured question, every patient follow-up, was a gentle magnifying glass over contradictions that had long been unnoticed. And as the tension thickened, the audience leaned closer, compelled by the drama unfolding, unable to look away. It was clear now. The moment was approaching. One line, one simple truth, could tip the balance entirely. The stage was set. The audience, both in the studio and at home, felt the atmosphere tighten. Something fundamental was about to shift. And the room collectively held its breath. And then Stern said the line that changed everything. Howard Stern's words didn't explode. They landed. Calm, deliberate, surgical. No volume, no theatrics, just clarity so sharp it cut through the carefully constructed calm of the studio. "You've spoken about the institutions that constrained you," he began, voice steady. "But across interviews, your accounts don't always match. How do we reconcile that?" The room fell silent. Not a harsh silence, but a dense, electric stillness that made every viewer lean in. The applause that had punctuated her sentences vanished. The host's smiles froze, their attempts to steer the conversation powerless against the undeniable weight of truth. Even the audience, trained to react on cue, stilled, sensing something unprecedented. A live, unscripted confrontation with reality. Meghan's eyes widened slightly, the first crack of hesitation visible. Her polished armor, perfected over years of rehearsed narratives, trembled under Stern's patient gaze. She attempted to recover with the same cadence she had relied on countless times before, repeating her rehearsed lines, softening claims, redirecting focus. But Stern didn't flinch. He didn't interrupt, but the pressure built. Each repetition sounded hollow, stripped of the reassurance it had once carried. For Stern, this wasn't about spectacle or humiliation. He wasn't here to deliver a performance. He was here to observe and reveal. He guided the conversation like a surgeon tracing precise lines. Every pause, every subtle inflection, amplified the truth lurking beneath layers of narrative control. For viewers at home, particularly those who had felt their voices minimized or erased in systems not built for them, it was a moment of validation. They had recognized the patterns, the inconsistencies, and now someone in the spotlight was acknowledging them without bias or fear. Meghan shifted in her seat, hands tightening on the table. Her voice, once confident and flowing, grew taut, strained. The protective buffer of friendly hosts and scripted audience responses no longer functioned. Each word Stern allowed her to speak, each carefully measured pause, magnified the fragility of the carefully curated persona she had maintained. The cameras captured the tension in minute detail. Every blink, every fleeting glance to the hosts, every subtle twitch in her posture. Stern pressed further, not aggressively, but inexorably. He highlighted patterns, gently pointing to contradictions in prior interviews, moments where personal narratives clashed with documented events, and subtle shifts in tone that suggested selective storytelling. "It's not the pain we doubt," he said, voice steady. "It's the performance. The way the story has been presented. Does it reflect the truth you live, or the image you wish to project?" The impact was immediate. Meghan's composure faltered. Her lips parted in a silent attempt to respond, but no rehearsed line could hold against the weight of Stern's calm precision. The audience sensed it instinctively. Something previously untouchable was now vulnerable. Gasps whispered through the studio, a faint shuffle of feet, the murmur of disbelief, the sudden tightening of every chest in the room. Even the hosts, allies by default, paused, unsure how to navigate the sudden collapse of control. And then the walkout began. It was gradual, almost understated at first. Meghan's fingers brushed the microphone, then gripped it, then pulled it free with a motion that signaled both retreat and frustration. The chair scraped softly against the floor. The silence that followed was deafening. Stern remained seated, eyes steady, calm, watching the unraveling not with glee but with the understanding that the stage had shifted irrevocably. Social media, though unseen in the moment, was primed for eruption. Clips would be clipped and posted, hashtags would trend, memes would form around a single, undeniable fact. The narrative that had been meticulously constructed was now public property, visible to everyone who had ever questioned it quietly, in the back of their minds. For viewers who had felt the sting of filtered truth in their own lives, there was satisfaction, yes, but also reflection. Here was accountability, raw and unvarnished, unfolding live before millions. And still, Stern spoke softly, almost conversationally, as if his calm made the moment heavier than any raised voice could. "The truth doesn't need a script," he said, the words landing like a hammer in a silent hall. They reverberated not only in the studio but across every screen, every mind watching. For the first time, it wasn't about control, applause, or image. It was about clarity, integrity, and the courage to allow the audience to see the unembellished story. The host scrambled subtly, producing cues, attempting to bridge the rupture, but the damage was done. Stern's questions, his patience, his refusal to accommodate false comfort, had created a space where reality could no longer be ignored. Meghan's attempts to regain composure were visible, almost heroic in their effort, but ultimately insufficient. Her confidence, meticulously curated over years, crumbled under the weight of observation rather than attack. The audience, both live and watching from afar, experienced a rare kind of suspense, the tension of moral reckoning framed not as spectacle but as inevitability. Every moment of hesitation, every subtle falter, reinforced the unfolding drama. The narrative had shifted. No one present could deny it. The air was thick with awareness that the story they thought they understood had been fundamentally altered, and that its reverberations would be felt far beyond the walls of the studio. And then it ended. Not with shouting, not with confrontation, but with departure. Meghan left the stage, chair pushed back, microphone in hand, the silence following her heavier than any applause could have been. Stern remained, calm, composed, the quiet epicenter of the upheaval he had wrought without a single raised voice. The cameras captured the stillness, the aftermath in every glance and breath, the weight of a moment that would be dissected endlessly across platforms, in living rooms, and on social media. The ripple effect had begun. What unfolded next, though, would prove even louder than the walkout itself, stretching far beyond the studio, far beyond that table, and far beyond the moment every viewer felt in their chest. The reckoning of perception versus reality had only just begun. The moment Meghan walked off the set, the world reacted instantly. Social media erupted like a storm breaking over calm waters. Clips of the exchange spread across platforms, shared with commentary, disbelief, and a mix of outrage and validation. Hashtags ignited, trending within minutes, while memes distilled the tension into images and captions that made the moment both universal and unforgettable. For audiences who had long sensed the performative nature of celebrity narratives, this was a vindication, a public acknowledgement that someone, finally, was willing to hold power accountable without hesitation. Television commentators dissected every frame, replaying Stern's calm precision, Meghan's faltering composure, and the subtle cues the live audience had felt but the world had only now begun to see. Every analyst, columnist, and influencer asked the same question. Had the narrative finally shifted? For progressive viewers, for those attuned to the pressures of public life as an outsider or immigrant, the answer was unmistakable. Stern had unveiled the cracks that had always existed, and they had been hidden only by approval, applause, and careful curation. Fans of Stern praised his restraint and strategic patience, framing him as a voice of reason amid the theater of celebrity. They admired how his calm dismantling of pretense had exposed inconsistencies without ever resorting to cruelty. Social media feeds filled with messages like "finally," someone willing to speak truth without theatrics, or "watching Stern was like watching honesty itself unfold in real time." These responses reflected a hunger for authenticity, for moments when public figures were held to the same scrutiny that everyday people face. The resonance was deep. It was not about tearing someone down, it was about witnessing accountability. Meanwhile, Meghan's supporters reacted with shock and anger, framing Stern's questions as cruel, unnecessary, or disrespectful. Clips were replayed endlessly, dissected frame by frame, with debates erupting over intention, tone, and impact. The polarized response only amplified the cultural significance of the moment. It was no longer merely a television incident. It became a touchstone in ongoing conversations about media privilege, narrative control, and who gets to define truth in the public sphere. Celebrities, pundits, and public figures joined the discourse, amplifying the ripple effect. Some defended Stern's approach, praising the importance of holding influential figures accountable. Others lamented the spectacle, calling for empathy and understanding. In every post, thread, and commentary, the core tension remained. Stern had exposed what many already suspected but had rarely been allowed to see publicly, the fragility beneath a carefully crafted narrative. The audience, especially those who identified with struggle, resilience, or the experience of being marginalized, recognized the stakes immediately. This was more than gossip. It was cultural validation. The memes, clips, and hashtags became shorthand for broader societal frustrations. People shared their own experiences of facing scrutiny or navigating systems designed to protect the powerful while punishing the vulnerable. The conversation extended far beyond entertainment. It entered discourse on social media about authenticity, privilege, and accountability. Discussions ranged from mainstream Twitter threads to niche progressive forums, all dissecting the interplay of power, perception, and performance. Stern's restraint became the centerpiece of admiration, a reminder that composure can amplify truth more than anger ever could. Media outlets quickly analyzed the long-term implications. Headlines debated whether this would redefine Meghan's public image or cement Stern's reputation as the unflinching arbiter of candor. Experts suggested that the incident reflected wider cultural fatigue with curated narratives and the performative empathy that often shields celebrities from scrutiny. For viewers who had always felt the weight of social and institutional scrutiny in their own lives, the spectacle validated their lived experience. Truth cannot always be filtered, rehearsed, or softened to avoid discomfort. The engagement metrics told the story. Clips went viral, engagement skyrocketed, and the conversation dominated both traditional and social media for days. Every retweet, like, and share reinforced the social validation layer. The public was invested, reacting not only to the confrontation but to the larger moral and cultural stakes it represented. It became a shared experience, a collective recognition that accountability could arrive even in spaces historically engineered to prevent it. Yet beneath the online frenzy, the most powerful moment was subtle. Stern's calm had allowed the audience to witness a dismantling not of a person, but of the protective structures surrounding a narrative. It was a lesson in precision, patience, and the power of observation. For immigrant and identity-affirming audiences, in particular, this resonated deeply. They saw not just a celebrity held to account, but a validation of the scrutiny, discernment, and resilience they themselves had long exercised in navigating life's inequities. And, as the clips continued to circulate, the commentary multiplied, and the meme spread, the larger question lingered. How would the story evolve? How would public perception shift once the dust settled? The walkout was only the beginning. The reverberations would continue to unfold, shaping conversations about honesty, privilege, and integrity in ways that no rehearsed narrative could contain. The stage had been set. The ripple was spreading. And what came next would define not just the moment, but the cultural memory of the confrontation itself. When the cameras finally stopped rolling, and the applause, or the silence, faded, what remained was more than spectacle. It was a mirror, held up not to the celebrity, but to the audience itself. Howard Stern had done something rare. He had created a space where honesty mattered more than performance, where restraint carried more weight than anger, and where the consequences of narrative curation became visible to all. For viewers who had spent their lives navigating systems that rewarded compliance and punished audacity, it was a moment of recognition. Dignity could withstand scrutiny, but pretense could not. The moral clarity of the encounter struck hard because it was not rooted in cruelty. Stern had not shouted. He had not mocked. He had waited, observed, and asked questions that allowed the truth to assert itself. This distinction mattered profoundly to progressive audiences, immigrant viewers, and anyone who had felt the sting of selective justice or the pressure to perform for survival. The heroism of restraint, of precision, was visible, and it reminded people that strength is often quiet, deliberate, and unwavering. For Meghan Markle, the walkout symbolized more than personal frustration. It was the public unmasking of the structures that had supported her narrative for so long. Her carefully managed victimhood, her selective storytelling, and her rehearsed responses all became visible under the lens of Stern's calm scrutiny. And while critics might call it humiliation, the more profound lesson was universal. Authenticity, when challenged respectfully but firmly, either endures or collapses. The moment highlighted the consequences of constructing narratives without the resilience to withstand interrogation, a lesson that transcended celebrity culture entirely. Audiences at home experienced this on multiple levels. Some felt vindicated, having long sensed the performative elements in celebrity culture. Others felt inspired, witnessing that courage and composure could dismantle illusion without resorting to malice. For progressive and immigrant viewers, there was an added layer of resonance. Stern's method mirrored lived experience. The careful observation, the subtle pressure, the insistence on truth, even when inconvenient, echoed the realities of navigating spaces where power is often unevenly distributed. They saw themselves reflected in the calm authority of someone willing to confront untested narratives without resorting to spectacle. The cultural implications were equally profound. This was not merely a viral moment. It became a touchstone in ongoing conversations about integrity, authenticity, and accountability in media. People debated not just what was said, but why it mattered. Honesty over optics, truth over performance, resilience over entitlement. Stern's approach illustrated that morality is reinforced not through theatrics, but through consistency, patience, and an unwavering commitment to clarity. For audiences who value justice and dignity, it was both a confirmation and an inspiration. Perhaps the most enduring takeaway was the way the encounter reframed power dynamics. The stage had been built to protect certain narratives, to shield voices from scrutiny, and to elevate curated pain. But when honesty arrived unflinchingly, that architecture crumbled, leaving only the essentials: truth, composure, and accountability. In that collapse, audiences recognized a broader moral. No matter how protected a narrative may be, it cannot withstand scrutiny without substance. In the quiet that followed, the conversation shifted. Media analysts, social commentators, and viewers alike began discussing what it meant to navigate life with authenticity. Stern's calm had become a lesson that true strength is not performative but principled, not loud but deliberate, not about domination but clarity. The impact was subtle, yet undeniable, a template for how truth, applied thoughtfully, could dismantle illusion without degradation. For progressive, identity-affirming audiences, the resonance went deeper. They saw parallels between this televised reckoning and the struggles faced by marginalized communities in everyday life. The principle was universal: to endure criticism, to face scrutiny, and to retain dignity is to be powerful. The moral lesson was not just about celebrities or interviews, it was about the courage to exist authentically, the patience to let truth unfold, and the responsibility to uphold integrity even when it is inconvenient. As social media continued to buzz, the larger reflection crystallized. Stern had revealed more than inconsistencies. He had revealed the human capacity to honor truth over comfort. The walkout, the silent pauses, the meticulous questioning, they all pointed to the same conclusion: dignity survives confrontation, but performance collapses when challenged. Audiences understood this instinctively, and they carried that understanding beyond the screen. And so, the reckoning ended not with a spectacle of defeat, but with a quiet affirmation: accountability matters, authenticity endures, and restraint can be a more powerful weapon than anger. In the moral architecture of this moment, viewers were invited to reflect, to aspire, and to recognize that truth does not bow to convenience, and dignity does not depend on applause. The stage was empty, the cameras off, but the lesson lingered. The audience carried it forward, recognizing that the moment was not merely about who won or lost, but about the values revealed under pressure. The reckoning had passed, but its resonance promised to echo far beyond the studio walls. The story of that moment didn't end when the cameras stopped rolling. It continued in every conversation, every retweet, every post debating what had unfolded on The View. Millions of viewers had witnessed more than a clash of personalities. They had witnessed a collision between curated narratives and unflinching honesty. They had seen that dignity could withstand scrutiny, and that truth, when patiently revealed, has a power no applause can match. For audiences who had long navigated systems that demanded compliance or rewarded performance, the resonance was personal. The walkout, the pauses, the calm questions, all became symbols of accountability and integrity. This was a reminder that stories, no matter how polished, are tested not by applause but by observation. And in that test, the audience discovers clarity for themselves, who embody sincerity, and who relies on the safety of rehearsed narratives. As we reflect on this encounter, the takeaway is universal. In a world full of manufactured narratives, courage is calm, honesty is bold, and dignity does not need a script. Howard Stern's measured precision revealed a truth many of us have always known. Standing firm in the face of illusion is a quiet, yet transformative form of power. Now it's your turn. Watch closely, question thoughtfully, and demand authenticity, not only from the people on your screens but in your own life. Share this story, talk about it, and let it remind you and others that truth, patience, and integrity matter more than performance or appearances. Subscribe to the channel to stay part of the conversation. Comment your thoughts, share your experiences, and be part of a community that values courage, honesty, and dignity. This isn't just a story, it's a lesson in seeing clearly, acting deliberately, and holding space for truth in a world that too often favors illusion. The stage may be empty now, but the conversation, and the values it illuminated, continue. Don't just watch. Engage. Question. Share. And remember, the truth doesn't need a script.